All right, can everyone hear me okay? Thank you. It's great to see so many familiar faces and some new ones. Hi, my name's Luke Henry. I'm a partner at LDB. Don't hold it against me, I am an accountant. I did actually, this photo is from last year, and I don't know how it is, but I've somehow timed my shirt to match. So I'm going to take that as a quick win. So let's get started. My talk today is All Funding Go, Case Studies in Funding a Studio. And part of the idea of talking to this is really an iteration of some previous talks that I've done, but recognising that a lot of the clients that were coming to see us were approaching us with a range of different circumstances and a range of different funding measures that they've come to, and a little bit beyond the DGTO, which was some of my previous talks, if you've seen me speak recently over the last couple of years. Now, I've got this introduction slide in here because I usually just barrel straight into my talk and forget to tell you who I am. I'm a partner at LDB. We're an accounting practice here in Melbourne. We work with a lot of game developers, about 60-odd studios these days of various shapes and sizes. And I got involved in games about 20 years ago. I know it's hard to believe. I look pretty young. Helping some young guys at university, and part of that adventure has sort of seen me follow their different iterations through and careers through the industry, and then meet lots of new faces along the way. So I'm really passionate and interested in helping studios start up, and as part of that process, it's a win for everyone, and we pick up clients and work forward from there. It's worth noting also, I don't want to honk the DGTO horn too much, but we're assessors for the Office of the Arts. So if you do have a DGTO question, feel free to come up and ask me. We'll have time for questions at the end as well of a general nature. So before we get into some of these funding options, I just wanted to have a bit of a chat around budgeting and why it's so critically important for studios to stop, once you've got that great idea, to actually stop and think about this and how we're going to get out there and fund it. And a key part of this funding measure is really going through this budgeting process, which is an idea of creating a financial plan, a cost structure, and understanding what is going to be involved with this great idea that you have. Budgeting is critically important in this industry because it can take many years to get a game out and get a game released. And we hear a lot of stories about solo developers grinding away for 7-odd years, I think was the keynote. So there's certainly a significant time frame between that initial idea and it coming out to market. So in that time, if you're going to get anywhere and you want to get anywhere fast, part of that will entail actually hiring staff, and with that comes a cost. And it's worth being aware of that and understanding and planning out what that looks like. The key focus for a lot of developers is this idea of burn rate, particularly for games like live op games. You'll want to know how much you're spending each month. You want to make sure that you're able to manage that and be able to dial that up and down as you need. And once you have a plan in place as to, well, what is it going to cost to actually build this game, then it gives you the opportunity to then say, well, how are we going to fund it? And what are the ways and means that we need to reach out to people and get access to the cash? Some people, and we are seeing this quite a lot, particularly for the smaller indie studios that are starting up, they're working off their own labour and their own time, and I think that's really important, particularly for people getting going, to have an investment of time in it. A lot of the screen agencies really expect an in-kind contribution, and that will often come in the form of unpaid hours, is what it is. But it is important to also recognise there that people have cost of living is quite expensive these days. You know, someone has to pay the rent, put food on the table, feed families, etc., etc. So there needs to be a recognition of your worth and contribution towards a project, and so I think it's worth putting a price on that. Ideally, what this budget will do is then give you a pathway and understand what the whole picture looks like, and then you can also use that to stress test and say, well, what happens here if the project's going to take an extra 6 months? What does that look like from a cost structure perspective? And how are we going to bridge that gap? And sometimes it's so critically important to actually focus on those important milestones to get a game out, because you know that the money will drive up. So let's start talking about some of the sources of funding that we commonly see out there. And the big one, if everyone's just come from the 2 o'clock session, you would have had a big conversation there between the various state bodies who have all been really supportive over many, many years in different formats. Each state screen authority is largely driven by film and TV, but also have quite dedicated game teams. And as part of that, they provide a series of rebates. Each state is a little bit different, but by and large, they will provide a production fund, which will provide a contribution towards the stages of development. And they can range from early stages through to later stages, so pre-production through to later stages of production. And then also a production rebate, which will reimburse a percentage of your production costs. And again, what is in a production cost is always the difficult question. For most of them, it's the direct development costs, provided that cost is directly linked to the state. So, being a Victorian, I have put up there the Vic Screen details, which is the Victorian Production Fund, provides a 10 to 15% of the budget in allocation, or 10 to 50% of the production costs, up to $300,000 per application or $500,000 project cap. All of the states have a very similar output and contributions, although some of them tend to focus and provide programs directly to emerging talent. The Victorian screen rebate is probably one of the less generous ones, but they do have one, and it's a 10% rebate on at least a minimum spend of $500,000. Now, some of the other states are a little bit more competitive. New South Wales is, the threshold there is $350,000. South Australia is $250,000, and Queensland, I believe, is the outlier. They're providing a 15% rebate and a lower threshold. So it's definitely worth exploring these grants. The challenge typically with the screen rebate is that money is typically provided after it's been spent. Let's jump forward now to the federal grants. Everyone would be quite familiar with Screen Australia. They've been a great supporter of the industry, and their grants are what are driving a lot of new studios coming to see us to have conversations around what their structure should look like and how they can advance their business. What we're seeing there is fixed contributions for small teams. Probably the most successful, I think, has been the Emerging Game Makers Fund. They've got small grants there for pre-production teams to get people up and running. And that's been a real boon for those people that are small teams that are looking to get started and get their foot in the door, and give them enough money to be able to hire some support and fill gaps in their team. The Games Production Fund is providing funding up to $100,000. It's interesting, that fund seems to be mostly hovering around that higher watermark. I know that's the upper threshold. I haven't seen too many that are getting much lower figures. Certainly be a good conversation with anyone from Screen Australia if they'd like to elaborate on how they determine that particular band of pricing. Probably an unknown one, and it's dropped away a little bit, but was previously quite strong, is the Export Market Development Grant. So EMDG is run by Austrade, a very popular product that was providing rebates on marketing spend, and it was focused on trying to attract as much business into Australia. There was a really great case study there with some game studios out of Queensland that were using it for user acquisition and have been funding that via EMDG. I think that's taken a step back now. I think there might have been a bit of a budget overrun there. So it is scaled back. For a lot of teams that are interested in doing some marketing, you can get access to grants of 20 to 30K. It's generally becomes a rebate and a refund against the marketing spend that you've incurred, but can cover things like advertising, direct marketing costs, and even to a limited extent trade shows, albeit there are some carve-outs for that. It's worth being aware of. The minimum spend there is $20,000, so it's probably really focused on those teams that have a reasonable budget for marketing, which you should have allocated some funds for, hopefully. So let's have a chat about investor funding. So investor funding is a really unusual piece in this industry. It tends to be coming about where you've got very established teams that maybe have a good pedigree, and there's an investor who's looking to back them into further projects. We don't see a lot of investor funding in the indie space, and it typically would come if someone's got a very, I suppose, advanced business understanding, as maybe jumping across into sort of the Silicon Valley tech sphere and working with some of the people over there. We've done some work with some probably more tech-affiliated businesses, and it's very much the vogue there, as ways to quickly ramp up the size of their team and build capital. Most of these arrangements are about subscribing for shares in your company. So when you're coming and seeing your accountant to set up your business initially, you're typically setting up a company here and issuing shares to yourselves as the shareholders. In this case, an investor would be coming along and would be subscribing for shares in the company and taking a percentage of that company into the future. Hence the reason why it's more focused around the team, because it's actually investing in the studio rather than an individual title. Typically, those sorts of deals are built on the back of the team being successful, and then over time, that team would then build out and produce more titles and create a system that has a resale value. And we certainly have seen quite a lot of corporate activity in the game space. I imagine most of you will be aware of key moves acquiring a number of studios over recent years. And that's largely linked to buying out talent and buying out teams. Typically, those investors are looking at that exit strategy, so that time frame around how long will it take for us to get a team established and then sold out. What we don't see often, certainly in my client base, is direct project funding. It seems to be few and far between. What we do, however, see is quite a lot of direct support from publishers. Now, I imagine everyone here is interested in that space. As an accountant, it's a bit of a black box for us. We tend to see the deal after it's been struck, and we don't have too much to say in the negotiations there. So I'm often an observer from the outside. What we can say is that typically the structure of these deals is an advance of funds that will be there to meet the costs of your budget, and they'll be allocated out across a series of milestones that will enable you to deliver the project as it's scoped. The way that the platforms make their money back, or the publisher makes their money back, is through recruitment of the sales from the games, and that can run, look, I've seen quite wild rates, usually as often as high as 90% recoupment up until that initial amount is recouped. And then after that, it would be some form of profit share between the parties. If you want to have a bit of a chat about that, I'm sure Andrew down the back and Cam Rogers will be able to have a bit more of a conversation. We work with the team, Cam Rogers' team, quite a bit for a number of clients. So you'll see a lot more of this. This tends to be for the more established studios and ones that have got a reasonable track record. So oftentimes we're seeing indie studios not starting out with publisher deals, or publisher deals that are not funding a huge proportion of the development cost. But it is becoming quite common, and I know Thursday's day is going to be quite active from what I understand in terms of the matchmaking with publishers. So it's definitely one to look out for and put yourself forward. At the moment, we're not seeing a lot of platform funding, so I'll caveat that by saying that VR seems to be quite active. We're still seeing, for a number of our VR developers, a lot of support, particularly coming from Meta. Previously, there was a lot more competition between the platforms and exclusivity was a factor. I don't think I've seen an exclusivity deal in the last 3 to 4 years. So it's definitely seemed to be transitioning away from that. Again, caveating it that I don't see every person in the game industry, so I can't talk for every single outcome that's there. I'm sure maybe there are some people that are doing it. And then distributor funding tends to be a little more niche, but we are seeing a little bit more activity there, particularly for the Asian markets. It's often focused around taking an existing title and providing localization, specialised marketing into that particular space. And as part of that, they might provide some upfront spending to facilitate development. Other forms of funding. So this is quite an interesting space because this is where you see quite a range of diverse approaches. Crowdfunding via a number of online platforms, the common one being Kickstarter, but there's a host of them out there now. For a while there, it was quite the rage, then it dropped completely away. I've certainly seen some more titles here in Australia popping back up. It seems to have an active space. Typically, this is not so much for sourcing funds, but building an audience, sometimes building out a passive Q&A team and broader marketing where you're sort of seeking out that evangelist. It is quite intensive. The comment that everyone that I've spoken to who's run a Kickstarter campaign is that there's a constant need for moderation, there's a lot of questions, there's a lot of activity, there's a need to drive momentum. So you need to be aware of that. I'm not talking anyone out of it, but understand that it is quite an intensive piece and that can draw away from your development. Subscriber-based revenue streams seem to be a really rising trend. We're seeing a lot of people, particularly coming from an art or narrative background where they're producing content on platforms like Patreon or Twitch. They're generating revenue streams there at an early stage in the development, and then that is creating an audience and a revenue stream that later leads to a release. It does seem to be very niche and more genre focused. So certainly if your title is in that space and you feel you've got the skill set there and maybe some early art, there can be some interest, but it can take also a bit of time. Again, you're cultivating a community. And then the last one that I've put up there is work for hire. We're probably seeing more teams pick this up. Sometimes it's as simple as, look, I need to have a job to pay the previously mentioned rent and food. And so someone will be picking up a part-time work. They're working with other teams on a contractor basis. Certainly for a lot of the startup studios, we're seeing that quite commonly where maybe they're able to pick up a grad role or picking up some contractor work with another startup team to help them build their career. Obviously, the harder you go down the work for hire piece, the more you compromise your time and your ability to get a title out. Okay, so let's have a chat about the federal tax incentives. It's a bit of a hot favourite of mine. It primarily comes in the form of 2 tax-linked rebates, the digital games tax offset and the R&D tax incentive. Now, a bit of history there, R&D tax incentive was quite commonly used, and in fact, for my first studio that I was working for 20 years ago, used it heavily. This was probably back at a time where we were seeing co-development of engines as well as titles, and engine tech was not commonly available and people tended to build in-house, and there would be a considerable investment of time and resources in that. That enabled R&D claim and was probably one of the first forms of rebate that we saw flowing into the industry. More recently, the DGTO has come out. Hopefully you've heard about it. It is industry-specific rebate, and it's going to provide a 30% rebate on your essentially remuneration paid to development staff that are located here in Australia, including contractors and including superannuation and work cover. It's basically linked to 3 different types of certificates. Certificate 1 is for a release of a game to the public, and it will cover the development costs from the start of development through to the day that the title is released. Certificate 2 is very similar in that it covers porting and will cover the cost of developing the port from commencement through to, again, the day of public release. It's worth noting, if you are doing the development for someone else, that day can be a little bit vague, and so oftentimes it's linked to whenever you provided all that is necessary for a public release to occur. The third certificate is this idea of live ops. It's for ongoing support of a game. It's a little bit different to the first 2 in that the first 2 have a $500,000 minimum spend per certificate, but that runs across the full time frame of development, so that can span multiple years. And so when we're talking to smaller startup studios, you might think, gee, 500,000 is quite a lot. I don't know that we're going to spend that. If you look at it over, say, a 3-year development cycle, even for 3 people, it's relatively within reach, I would suggest, depending on how you can access funds. Part of that piece is obviously, again, coming back to how you're budgeting this out. Certificate 3 is a little unusual in that it is linked to a 12-month window. So it's basically covering development costs, things like patching, if you're doing live ops on a game, all those costs, and that's covered on a 12-month period. The minimum spend is still $500,000, so that is a little bit more of a stretch and will require studios to probably have a number of staff there. R&D is somewhat similar. It provides a rebate. Now, I've put a number of 43.5% up there. That can change quite dramatically. There's a number of circumstances there where that can adjust up or down, or typically around that mark is what we see being accessed. It's generally focused around this idea of core activities that are experimental and are basically undertaken to generate new knowledge. So the idea is that you've got something that needs to be solved, you're uncertain that it can be solved, and you need to follow through a scientific process to work out the outcome, and there's a degree of risk there that you may not achieve an outcome. So certainly, when I speak to a lot of developers, they would say, well, that is what we do day in and day out. And the challenge, the one caveat is that given enough time, I think a lot of developers will be able to solve these problems. So there needs to be a quite technical issue, something that is completely unknown that you're working on. So I've got a small table here, just where I'm comparing and contrasting the two. So it doesn't come up lined up quite that well, but these are lined up. So rebate-wise, the digital games tax offset, the industry-specific one is at 30%. The R&D rate will coming in at 43.5% in most cases. Both of them have a 2-stage application process. For DGTO, it's through the Office of the Arts, who you would have seen around GCAP over the last couple of years. And the R&D application process is handled through Oz Industry, which is another federal department. Once you're approved by those 2 departments, then it proceeds essentially to your tax return, where in the case of R&D, you'll complete a schedule with some detail. In the case of DGTO, it's a single box on the tax return. So it's claimed as part of the tax return process. The minimum spend for DGTO, as I touched on earlier, is quite significant. It's $500,000. For R&D, it's as low as $20,000. So there is quite a difference there in terms of accessibility. DGTO is largely limited to expenditure on wages, super, contractors, those core costs of developing the title, whereas in R&D's case, it merely needs to be deductible, obviously needs to be directly linked to that core activity that is going on in R&D. So what that means for a lot of studios if they have a significant software cost, if they have a significant overhead cost, like they're running an office or something like that, then those costs are not going to be captured by GGTO, whereas in the case of R&D, they can be. We've covered off there already the certificates, and so essentially for most studios, particularly if it's focused around a release, that the first time you're going to be accessing DGTO will be when you have a public release, a certificate 1, and that will be at the release of the game, and it will be claimed on the tax return of the year of release. In the case of R&D, it's an annual process, so you're largely claiming as you go, and that can be advantageous, particularly if you're looking to source funds along the way and meet the cost of your budget through the course of development. The piece that probably changes things a little bit is with regard to deductibility. Now, I appreciate I'm talking in sort of dry tax concepts here, but DGTO does not reduce deductibility of the expenditure. So all of this money, when you receive income in the future, the costs that you have incurred will be deductible against that income and mean that you will not be paying income tax on that amount. That's quite different with R&D. R&D means that those costs you've incurred are no longer deductible. And so whilst the R&D rate is certainly more attractive as compared to the DGTO rate, the minute that you start earning $1 of income, that changes quite dramatically. And I expect most people in this room will be aiming to generate revenue from their title. And therefore, what we quite commonly see is the value of the rebate for R&D actually erodes and drops away to an effective rate of 18.5%, which is lower than the DGTO rate. Now, this last one, I think I can't stress enough, and is of critical importance to everyone in this room, is the risk around claims. So DGTO is what I would call low risk, extremely low risk. The ATO do not look at DGTO claims. It's assessed by the Office of the Arts, and once that number goes in the tax return, that's the figure. It's locked in. So you can operate with some confidence. R&D is quite different. R&D is a measure that is broadly available to all businesses, and as a result of that, you're seeing over recent years quite a runaway in government expenditure in this space. And as a result of that, the ATO are very keen to try and rein in expenditure here and have the ability to review applications. My previous comment around that was that you would expect a review of an R&D claim probably once every 4 years. I would say that's probably increasing. Certainly for my clients that have been claiming R&D, we're seeing more activity from the ATO. And also in particular, more aggressive activity from the ATO. So they are trying to recover money and look for ways to reduce the claim. The result of that is that you have to go through essentially quite a combative experience. And as a result, from my perspective, in this space, if given the choice, I would always be looking to claim under DGTO. It's a far easier process, it's crystal clear, and there's no ambiguity there around this sort of piece around technology. Now, if you do have a higher spend on technology, on that sort of core technologies piece, and you think that it is something that's relevant for your business, then I definitely encourage you to speak to some of the experts that are out there and get some support on it, because you would not want to do this on your own. Okay, so we've covered a lot, and I've sort of spoken at you for a bit. So now I'm going to present some case studies that I have. These are based on studios that we've worked with. I have adapted the data a little bit, so it's not truly reflective of any one individual studio, and it is anonymised anyway. So let's have a look at what we've been seeing. So hopefully you can see this. Apologies. Apologies if the table's a little bit hard to read from the back. This particular chart is recognising a studio that was a small team of developers, and they were starting their game out working from home. Their cost structure was relatively low. So this grey line here, I don't know if you can see marker is basically them incurring only those core costs that they need. So their wages were not being paid in these early days, other than a small piece here, and then it dropped back to virtually nil during the middle of development. These orange bars here are Sprint Australia grants. So received in two portions, relatively early in development. And that's enabled the studio, the team, to basically work their way through the development over this period to the point where they're getting a release. This blue column here is a spike. That's the first month of revenue from the title, and it's quite common. You'll see a spike in that first month and then it drops away. Interestingly, you see a follow-up spike here, which is linked to release on a further platform. So it gave it an additional audience. There is some other income floating around, tends to be a little bit more later on in the space, but this is quite common of what we see for those studios that are starting up, typically straight with Screen Australia funding and working through. So from a budget standpoint, this budget's relatively straightforward. There's not a lot of costs there. They're basically only paying themselves where they're receiving Screen Australia grants. And it's only later that they actually have the money coming in from sales that they're generating income to pay their wages. Now, obviously, that's a little bit dangerous because it requires you to have some confidence that you're going to be generating sales. And if anyone knows how to predict whether a game is going to generate sales, I'd love to meet you, buy you a drink. Okay, so let's have a look at case study 2. Case study 2 is, and I apologise, I could not get the bloody colours to be consistent, so they're going to jump around a little bit. Case study 2 is very similar in that it was a smaller team. It was a student team originally. They went into pre-production and had a great idea and received a series of grants. Now, I've actually blended them together in this table. These earlier ones were state-based grants and some smaller funding from arts bodies. And that enabled them to get through pre-production, at which point, basically in this period here, they were running on the smell of an oily rag and weren't paying themselves any wages. So this was just the studio operation costs, the overhead. Then they were able to sign with one of the state-based agencies and Screen Australia, and they received quite significant funding in a series of tranches, these green lines here. Together with, at the same time, they received a publishing agreement that actually funded quite a significant proportion of the development cost. So the development cost here is this grey line. You see it ramping up quite significantly. The spikes are then succeeding milestones. And then this little yellow line just here, you can barely see it, there's another one there, is them actually receiving sales from their title. So this studio was ultimately, I think, successful for the publisher. The reason the revenue is quite low is because of the recruitment that I was talking about earlier. So there was not a lot of cash coming through from the sales. Most of the sales proceeds were being generated and returned back to the publisher to repay these blue lines. Quite late to the party is our DGTO, this purple line here, which is quite significant. Unfortunately, you can see there that the DGTO, this is quite common criticism of the DGTO, is that it is coming late to the party for that particular title with all the costs, the bulk of the costs being incurred here. Is this interesting? Are people finding this valuable? Yeah. We've got some questions. Do you want to? We can take them in this session.
Yeah, sure.
We've got a roving mic here.
Thank you. My only question about this was, is this entire period, because the DGTO only started in like 2020, is it 2023 that it goes back to? 22. Is this from 2022 or is it only from a little part way through?
These, and I should have said this earlier, these are on months.
Oh, okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So it's probably a little over. It ended up being about 3 years, this particular
Hi, that's an awful lot of grant lines you've got there. Are those lots of individual separate grants, or is that the same grant making multiple different payouts at different times?
Good question. Yeah, in this case, it's a series of grants. So it was a combination of both state and federal grants, as well as some, I think they got some small grants from like creative bodies. Not material, I would say, in terms of significance, but certainly state and Screen Australia grants. And the reason you see them staggered is because they're linked to milestones often. So you're not getting all the money up front, they're getting a drip fed out to them. Anyone else? Okay. This is an unusual model. This is based on a business that had more of a live ops team. So we're looking here around how the title was initially funded, and probably the core funding actually came from founder loans. So this is people coming to the table with some money, getting up and running, and being willing to carry that initial cost. Relatively quick to market, producing small amounts of revenue really along the way, quite consistently. You see some spikes there as there's core releases coming through. A series of very small state-based grants. Didn't really move the dial, but certainly in this case helped cover some of those initial costs. And then probably unusually, this is one of the unusual cases we see where we're getting equity funding coming in this case in 2 tranches, to fund quite a significant increase in cost structure. So in this instance, the investor funding has been critical to getting the game off the ground. So whereas the previous case study we were looking at here was largely through a publisher agreement, and that's largely flowing in line with the costs as they're being incurred. In this instance, and this is quite typical of investor funding, it's coming through all in one go, so it's quite significant, and providing a huge amount of funding in one lot to basically cover the full development cycle. Ultimately, again, you see DGTO coming in, no longer purple but green, right at the end, after the fact. Okay, so this one here is probably the most complicated mix that I have seen for a development. This is a multi-year development. You can see there I've picked a number of different sources of funds coming through. The origins of the title were based around state-based funding and small amounts of investor contribution. So very early stage shareholders, largely closely linked to the developer's family and the like. Pre-sales through crowdfunding in 2 lots. A distributor agreement here that was basically taking a small slice and putting some early funding in that really got them going. And then when you saw the publisher funding really kick in, much the same as that second case study, you're seeing the costs start to increase. And these spikes of green again coming in with the milestones. Costs actually spike just close to release, and you can see the sales coming online here. And then later on you'll see some further funding. This is actually following through with a secondary project, so probably not as related to the overall singular project here, but is separable. Yeah.
Yeah, does that cost spike close to release represent marketing? Do you know? I don't need the mark, is that okay?
Did everyone hear that?
Yeah. I heard it up the back and you're all good.
Yes, an element of it was. Yeah, definitely. And then you can see DGTO coming in again after the fact. Now, in this case, the studio was rolling into a second project, so what we're seeing with DGTO, and it's quite common, is that it's rolling into the next project. It's not the funding that's useful for the first project that you're all currently working on, but it enables the creation of the next title. And hopefully that, together with the sales, is everything you need. Okay. I've timed that perfectly. Yeah. I was hoping for 10 minutes of questions, so Has anyone got any questions on that? We've got a roving mic just for those people that can't.
Thanks, that was super interesting. It looks like a lot of teams are running off like the smell of an oily rag. Who's making money out of all of this?
That is a really good question. I mean, I think what you find, and probably some of the examples there have been remuneration that's been paid through for the team that are running it. So in case study 2, which is probably the one that I see most commonly, this cost structure here included market remuneration for all the developers that were owners of business as well. So in the question of who's making money, they were being remunerated for their time and effort. So I'd like to think that for this project, even though this studio closed after this, that they had a period of employment and they were happy with that outcome.
Cool.
One down.
Sorry, just to absolutely clarify, with the DGTO, that is purely for wage remuneration and not licensing fees as well for engines or other software costs?
That's correct. No software costs. No. Wages, superannuation, work cover and contractors. There are obviously some special carve-outs there, so it's worth exploring what that are, particularly for related party transactions and for subcontracting arrangements you need to be very mindful of. But by and large, it's limited to those core costs.
If you don't need grants, like if you've got a plan where it kind of looks like you can do it,
Yep.
is it still worth it to get grants?
I think this comes down to the budgeting piece. So there's not too many people where they're able to do all things. So I would encourage you to sort of explore and understand what your skill set is and whether you truly can do all things or whether you'd be better off deploying that to, you know, you're a great developer, but are you really an artist? Would you be better off, you know, engaging a contractor to help meet that aspect? And that can bring your game to market a lot sooner, which if you're chasing, you know, the revenue from the sales to fund the next project, well, then it's worth doing, because the longer you sit and iterate, the less your game's not out there. So it's definitely worth it, I would suggest. Not to discount the time and effort that goes into the grant process. We've got this gentleman down here who's been waiting patiently.
Hi, Luke. Thank you so much for the talk. It was really interesting. This might have been a throwaway comment, but something you said sort of just stuck in my brain a little bit. It was curious to me that you described the DGTO as kind of like kicking in to generate that seed funding maybe for the next project.
Yes.
That sort of mentality.
Yeah.
That's a bit curious to me because a studio will often sort of start the next project before they've finalised this one.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which I'm just wondering where the thought process was from the people who get to make the decisions about what it represents. Do you have any insights on that sort of idea?
I did contribute to the consultation process, and that was probably one of my initial comments, that if it was going to be a rebate that occurred after expenditure, how helpful is that to the current development? And that, I think, is generally the industry feedback, that the fact that it's happening so much later in the piece. I think where it works is probably for larger studios where you're trying to attract funding from overseas, because you've got the ability to say, hey, here's my budget, here's what I'm going to spend on all of these costs to get this game to market, and I've got some confidence that I'm going to be getting 30% of it back. So if you can build that into your contracting arrangements, I think you can get some really good outcomes and it can help secure a deal. Yes, absolutely. So definitely critically important to that budgeting piece. Yeah.
It's my understanding that you can claim the EMDG and the DGTO at the same time because they're for different, I suppose, like purposes, like marketing versus development.
Yes.
Can you claim, so say if you were like building, because the R&D is for that, as you said, kind of trying to understand or solve a problem.
Yes.
Can you claim R&D if you're, say, developing a software alongside making a game, or do they have to be, I suppose, like separated under different entities if you wanted to try and claim both for different types of
You can
work?
yeah, it doesn't have to be in separate entities. It can certainly be claimed within the one corporate structure. Sometimes you would look to do it in different corporate structures, particularly if you're looking at like asset protection strategies. We've definitely seen that and implemented that for a number of studios. EMDG does not require or is not mutually exclusive with the DGTO. In fact, you'll probably find that the costs that are eligible for EMDG would not be something you'd be claiming under DGTO anyway. Yeah, so it wouldn't be an issue there. But R&D, you can't claim R&D and DGTO. It's one or the other. No, sorry.
Which? What?
You're there. We'll start there. We'll come to you.
Okay. Sorry, what? Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's all good. My question is regarding, I guess, the DGTO and R&D and the other rebates.
Yes.
Would that rebate work with in-kind contributions, or is it only for expenditure of actual currency?
Yeah, it's only for actual the transition. So if we talk about remuneration paid to owners, and it is capped at $65,000 per year for related parties for DGTO, that would need to be paid as wages. Typically what we see in those sorts of arrangements is the wages paid and then maybe advanced back to the company as a loan. So the leakage of cash would probably be around superannuation and PAYG withholding taxes. That's typically where you see most of that sort of challenge arise. So it does mean that for owners, if you are willing to take that lower salary, you can still achieve an outcome of it and get access to DGTO.
Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. And typically take that cash later on as repayment of the loan. Waiting patiently. Thank you.
I might have missed it if you mentioned it, but I think you didn't mention business loans or bank loans at all as a potential source of funding. Is that just not worth considering at all?
I haven't seen it in 20 years. It hasn't occurred. Typically, any Australian finance is looking at some form of security. We were expecting there to be more lending opportunities for DGTO to try and address the fact that this development costs occurring here, and the DGTO is coming in at the later point. I've seen one studio do it with film financier. But because of the way that film finance works with what are called SPVs, so special purpose vehicles, they're able to achieve a level of security there. That structure really doesn't work for games. Having said that, there are a number of R&D funders that are out there, and we're trying to reach out to them and have conversations with them around whether they're interested. But I think you need to be mindful of the cost. The interest cost on those sorts of loans can be significant. Yeah.
Hi, Luke. Thanks for the talk. Just about the DGTO one, the $500,000 starting point. Does that sort of, excuse my lack of tax knowledge, does that kind of mean there's a dead zone between like 350 and 500 where why would you spend that amount? Because once you've got to that point, you need to get to the $500,000 to get the 30%. Matt
mentioned that to me just earlier today. I think you're right. Yeah, it does appear that it's going to be sort of, if you're in that middle ground, you might as well spend the money because you're going to get it back, assuming you can find it. Yeah. So the only counterpoint to that is, again, coming back to this idea of if you're spending longer on development, is that actually getting the game out to market? You can spend the money, but is it actually improving anything?
Yeah, I guess you can't artificially inflate our wages for a year or so just to get to that. It just seems like,
No.
paying-wise, you wouldn't want to sit in that 350 to 500 spend.
No, that's right.
It's probably outside your wheelhouse, but with publisher support, do they care about their DGTO, seeing as it's coming in so late throughout the cycle of development? Like, is that even a selling point to say, hey, we're also going to get this, but it's all the way at the end of the project?
Look, the feedback I'm getting that it is, certainly from international parties, because when you're looking at a worldwide economy and you can get development done out of South America at very low rates, the rebate coming in and reducing that cost here in Australia means that we're competitively placed globally.
Understood. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, we've probably got time for one more.
Last one.
I was just wondering if there's any situation in which the publisher reimbursement stops and they suddenly make a lot of money. Does that happen?
It doesn't tend to stop. From what I've seen, look, some of the contracts have like a term to them that they will eventually extinguish. That'd probably be one that comes down to negotiation with the publisher.
Right.
And depend on the nature of the game as well, how long that, it's expected to be in market. If it's going to be a live ops game that's going to run for a significant period of time, then I would expect that sort of royalty stream would be flowing for a while.
Right. So the publishers don't just recuperate their costs; they recuperate plus some more.
That's right.
Indefinitely.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, they'll be in, and that percentage will vary.
Thank you.
All right, that was the last question, but feel free to come up and ask any questions. We'll be floating around. I've got my guys here, Tom and Adam, happy to take questions as well. So, yeah, happy to talk about it. Thanks for your time.